The World Affairs Council of Greater Houston welcomes you to the 50th anniversary celebration featuring Nikki Haley. Since 1969, the World Affairs Council has promoted greater understanding of the world, has delivered thousands of programs promoting bipartisan dialogue, introduced thousands of students to international affairs, and hosted hundreds of trips internationally. Please welcome to the stage the World Affairs Council's Director of Development and International Travel and Director of Programs, Sonia Bayou and Ronan O'Malley.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me good? Happy birthday, World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Thank you, everyone, for your continued friendship and support. Please join me in recognizing tonight's sponsors, gold sponsor, Janet and James Golden of Domain Communities, LLC. Silver sponsors, ExxonMobil Corporation, represented by our board member Laura Logan. Stephanie and Frank Suru, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandia, and thank you, all of you, for joining us for our 50th celebration, our 50th year in Houston. It's a delight to have you all here tonight. Currently, there are over 100 different World Affairs Councils across the United States. The councils first formed in the aftermath of World War I and grew significantly after World War II. The councils were created with the important understanding that the previous periods of American isolationism had left the United States and the world less secure and less stable. The councils were created with the important understanding that previous periods of American isolationism had led to a world that we could not tolerate, and we had not taken care of our allies and what we need to do in different parts of the world. In response, the councils were formed to promote global understanding and engagement by the American public regarding our nation's role in the world. The World Affairs Council of Greater Houston is one of the largest and most active councils and public forums in the United States, with over 3,000 members, over 100 events each year, and a total annual attendance of over 15,000 people.
Each of our board members has been extremely supportive of the work that we do, has a vested interest in our community and our commitments on a daily basis, and a growing passion of our organization. We are so successful and able to further engage our mission of educating the Greater Houston area community by continued leadership, wisdom, guidance of our board members. Their greatly appreciated efforts have been indispensable for our team's success over the years and will be for the years to come. I think it's safe to say that we are proud to be part of this organization. Please join me in thanking our board members, past and present. If you would please stand. Thank you.
As part of the Council's nonprofit and nonpartisan educational mission to inform the Greater Houston area on everything from foreign policy and international development to intercultural issues and global business and economics, the Council hosts a wide variety of speakers throughout the year, from foreign presidents, prime ministers, and ambassadors to numerous secretaries of state and U.S. secretaries of defense, as well as national security advisors over the years. And also, we've hosted commanding generals and admirals in the U.S. military and directors from the U.S. intelligence agencies. We've also hosted renowned foreign policy analysts and experts and cutting-edge journalists and business leaders.
Houston has the third largest consular corps of the United States, close to 95 consulates, honorary and career. It has been our privilege to get to know and engage with so many consulates. In audience tonight, representatives from China, Croatia, Ghana, Hungary, Germany, Portugal, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Vietnam. Thank you for your continued leadership. Council Corps members, if I did not note some of you, my apologies. May I ask you to stand? Thank you.
To further open the world to our members, the Council also offers an incredible array of travel destinations and exciting itineraries with 10 to 12 unique trips each year. On our trips, in addition to seeing the well-known site highlights and attractions, we also make time to meet with local leaders, journalists, and academics to gain a better understanding of the people and what matters most in their country. We've traveled to all corners of the world, including unique trips to places that most Americans have never visited, including Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. We have some incredible trips planned for 2020, including being one of the first groups of Americans to visit Saudi Arabia as official tourists. And we hope that you might consider joining us on our travels going forward.
Last but not least at all, we need to acknowledge the backbone of this organization, the driving force behind all that we do. Without you, WAC members, there should be no programs, no fantastic guests, or great timely conversations. Your growing support is what brought us here today, and we are very, very thankful for your continued attendance to the events and for relationships that we have developed over the years. I've had the pleasure to personally travel with lots of you, share some good memories, and it gives me such a great gratification to hear when you enjoy your programs. Thank you all. And now let's play a little game. It's like a wedding game. Those who are members for 1 year or more, would you stand up? 1 year or more. 1 or more. That means a lot. That's a lot. That means everybody should be standing. 1 and above. So if it's longer term, we're going to start with a smaller number. We're going to build it up. So everybody who's 1 year, 2 years, 20, 50, everybody stand up. More than 1 year. Frank, I know you've been a member for more than 1 year. Those who have been members for more than 5 remain standing. That's good. Those who have been members for more than 10 years. Those who have been members for 15 or more years. Wow. 16 or more years. 17 or more years. There are still people standing. 18 or more years. 19 or more years. 20 or more. That's good. Keep standing. 21, 22, 23, 25, 30. Geez, Alan, what's the number? 19 since 1970. I really thank you, and I really hope that 10 years from now, at least half the room will be standing in a category of 10 years or more. So again, thank you all for being here. I think that concludes our remarks. Okay, sorry.
Can't forget our students and educators. Lastly, this week is International Education Week, as designated by both the United States Department of State and the Department of Education. And in recognition, I would like to acknowledge the many years of great programming and outreach that the Council has done and continues to do for high school and college students and their incredible teachers and professors. The Council provides numerous events and workshops just for students and educators at no charge, and it also provides open and free access to many of our events for the general public, such as tonight. Currently, we work with all the major colleges and universities in the greater Houston area, and we have over 45 high school-based student world affairs councils, which are active in public schools, private schools, and homeschool groups across the city. Tonight, we're delighted to host over 130 students from 3 different universities and 14 different high schools. Would all of you students and educators please rise to stand to be recognized? All right, thank you all very much, and we look forward to the show.
Please welcome our student presenters, Mackenzie Jorage from Memorial High School and Edmund Bayou from College Park High School.
Maryanne Maldonado has been featured as one of Houston's most influential women and also recognized as Chief Operating Officer of the Year. Maryanne Maldonado currently serves as Chief Executive Officer of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Her work previous to joining the council includes Chief Operating Officer of one of Houston's largest commercialization centers, Head of International Trade and Investment for UK Trade and Investment, and Energy Trade Commissioner with the Department of Foreign Affairs for the Government of Canada.
Nikki Haley was appointed as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations from 2017 through 2019. During her role as UN Ambassador in 2017, she navigated through the challenging crisis with North Korea by working out a series of sanctions. In 2018, Ambassador Nikki Haley impressively handled the humanitarian crisis in Sudan by securing an arms embargo. She previously served as the first female Indian American governor of South Carolina from 2011 to 2017. During her leadership as governor, the state announced more than 85,000 new jobs and $21.5 billion in capital investment. In 2016, she was named by Time magazine as the 100 most influential people in the world.
When South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley was sworn in, she became the state's first female governor.
Results are what I promised the people of South Carolina, and results is what I'm determined to give them.
Governor Nikki Haley says it is the single largest economic investment in the state's more than 200-year history.
Mercedes-Benz vans, full manufacturing right here in Charleston County.
It is a great day in South Carolina.
$560 million invested, 1,700 jobs right here in Chester County. It's a great win. So the best part of what has happened over the past couple of years is watching all of these jobs not just go into cities, but go into rural South Carolina. Because if you can give a person a job, you take care of a family. And we watched a lot of families get taken care of over the past couple of years.
President-elect Trump has asked South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley to be his ambassador to the United Nations, and she's accepted. The daughter of Indian immigrants is considered a rising star in the Republican Party. Haley would be the first woman appointed to Trump's cabinet.
Our new ambassador to the United Nations is living proof of the promise of America.
For anyone that says you can't get anything done at the UN, they need to know there's a new sheriff in town.
There is a new U.S. UN. You are going to see a change in the way we do business. For those that don't have our back, we're taking names. For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias. If, for any reason, North Korea attacks the United States or our allies, the U.S. will respond, period.
She's so tough. And she's so consistent. And you just know you're not going to move her.
America's just said we want our embassy in the capital, and that capital is Jerusalem.
America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do. And it is the right thing to do. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that. What we witnessed here today in the Security Council is an insult. It won't be forgotten.
Standing her ground, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley making it clear.
I will not shut up. Rather, I will respectfully speak some hard truths.
Haley shows us what American foreign policy looks like with the spy.
Some people say there's a little too much swagger. You know that.
I don't think it's swagger. I think it's passion. I am very passionate about defending the United States.
As Nikki said, the world is really respecting the United States again.
Didn't know that I would be elected into the legislature. I didn't know that I would be governor. I certainly never thought I would be UN ambassador. Even though I'm a private citizen now, I know I'm too young to stop fighting.
And celebrate.
Well, do you want to say a Texas hello?
Well, thank you to Houston for coming out. It's so great to be with you. I have to tell you that I always, as governor of South Carolina, I always referred to South Carolina as mini Texas. Because our values are the same, the way we think is the same. I mean, the kindness of people is the same, the work ethic is the same. And so it was always just something that I felt every time I come to Texas, I feel like I'm home. And now that you have Deshaun Watson, I really feel like I'm home.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everybody. Ambassador, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Tonight we'll be discussing the ambassador's her new book, With All Due Respect. First, let me express my personal admiration and respect to you for serving our country. Thank you.
Thank you.
For those who've just received her book, it's a thorough account, including her early years growing up as an Indian American girl in a rural community, to serving her first female governor of South Carolina, where her courage and conviction led to the removal of the Confederate flag from the grounds of the state capitol, to her experiences leading the state during the horrific racial shootings, and also, of course, her time as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and many more accomplishments. And I hope you all enjoy the read as much as I did. So, Ambassador, you open your book describing your childhood as a daughter of Sikh immigrants in rural South Carolina and experiencing firsthand racial segregation. Tell us how that shaped you personally and professionally.
Well, we were the only Indian family in a small southern town. We weren't white enough to be white. We weren't black enough to be black. My father wore a turban. He still does to this day. My mother wore a sari, and they didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. And I remember when I would come home from the playground after being teased, my mom would always say, your job is not to show them how you're different. Your job is to show them how you're similar. And it's amazing how that lesson on the playground played out in the corporate world as governor and as ambassador. Because when you're faced with a challenge, if you first talk about what you have in common, everyone lets their guard down and you can go on and tackle the challenge and the solutions. But, you know, it's funny, we had strange experiences in that southern town, but that town came to accept us. But there was one time where my mom decided to put me and my sister in the We Miss Bamberg Pageant. It was the thing to do. It's what all the mothers did. And so my sister and I went to we're excited about being in the pageant, and they disqualified us because they had a black queen and they had a white queen, and we didn't fit. And so they gave me a beach ball, and my mom said, but she's been practicing her talent. Can she at least sing her song? And they said, yes, you're not ready. The song was, this land is your land, this land is my land. You can't make that up, right? So I swore off pageants after that. But, you know, I say that in that small town, while we did have those experiences, that town came to accept us. And the United States came to accept my family. And if it wasn't for those blessings, my mother wouldn't have opened a business. My father wouldn't have become a professor. I wouldn't have become governor or ambassador. So we have been blessed to be in America, that's for sure.
So jumping fast forward a little bit, I'm sure some of this bias impacted your responses to the tragic killings at the Emanuel African Methodist Church when you were governor. Can you tell us how that affected you and your fellow South Carolinians and how you responded to that?
Well, Mother Emanuel is one of the oldest African American churches in the South, and very historic and well known. But the tragedy and the shootings of Mother Emanuel really brought South Carolina to her knees. It was the first time there had been a shooting in a place of worship, and it was tough because here you had 12 people do what so many people in South Carolina do every Wednesday night. They went to Bible study. But on that night, someone else showed up. He didn't look like them. He didn't act like them. He didn't sound like them. They didn't throw him out. They didn't call the cops. Instead, they pulled up a chair and prayed with him for an hour. And when they bowed their heads in that last prayer, he began to shoot. These were people like Ethel Lance, who had lost her daughter 2 years prior to breast cancer, and she had a broken heart. But she would go around Mother Emanuel Church, cleaning the church, singing, "One day at a time, sweet Jesus, that's all I ask of you. Give me the strength to do every day what I have to do." Our youngest victim, Tywanza Sanders, had just graduated college, had the world in front of him. But on that night, he stood in front of his 87-year-old great Aunt Susie and looked at the killer and said, "You don't have to do this. We mean no harm to you." Or it was people like Cynthia Hurd, whose life motto was simply to be kinder than necessary. That's who these people were. They weren't famous, but they loved their families, they loved their church, and they loved their community. And when this happened, everyone was just shocked and devastated because we hadn't seen anything like that happen before. And there was a senator who was pastor of the church. And when we found out that this had happened, the first thing I did was call Senator Pinckney because I knew that he was supposed to be in Columbia that day for the legislature. And I called him and I said, "Senator, I just heard what happened. We've got the investigative team on their way to Charleston. I will be there first thing in the morning. Whatever the families need, we will be there. I'm just so very sorry this has happened." And what haunts me to this day is that he was one of the people in the church, and that phone was ringing in his pocket after he had been shot. And so that's difficult. A day later, the killer comes out with his manifesto, and there he is holding up the Confederate flag all over the website, all over his manifesto. And then a couple of days after that, the families looked at the killer. They went to the courthouse. The judge allowed them to speak, and they stood in front of the killer and addressed him one at a time, unplanned, unprompted. And they forgave him. It was the kind of forgiveness that was godly and so hard to understand at the time. And the national media wanted to define the narrative. They came in and basically took over the state. And I just felt like I had to keep my arms around the state and protect everyone because they wanted to talk about gun control. They wanted to talk about racism. They wanted to talk about, the death penalty. And I said, there will be a time and place where we will have this conversation, but it is not now. I desperately wanted the families to be able to grieve. And so it was at that time when the manifesto came down that I said, the flag has to come down. It had been flying atop the State House up until 2000, and they had a compromise that actually put the Confederate flag right in front of the State House. It was almost even more visible. And I remember when we were having those, when I had made that decision, I didn't tell anyone, but I scheduled 4 meetings that Monday morning. And one was with the Republicans, one was with the Democrats, one was with the congressional delegation, and the other was with a group of community leaders. And I said to each group, I said, I'm going to have a press conference at 4 o'clock and ask for the flag to come down. If you will stand with me, I will forever be grateful. And if you don't, I won't tell anyone you were in this room. And I had my husband there with me because I was so worried no one would show up. So my husband was there for moral support. But we had the press conference. It was a brutal debate in terms of that. Through all of this, I was having breakfast with Jesse Jackson like every other day, trying to keep him at bay and make sure that he was in the loop and not saying anything that would cause harm. I actually talk about it in the book. I had to yell at Al Sharpton and say, you are not going to divide our state during this time. And, you know, the Senate quickly, what made this legislation hard was it took a 2/3 vote. And so the Senate actually quickly passed the bill because Senator Pinckney was their brother. They all felt the pain of him being gone. And when it got to the House, that's when we hit the snag. And the Speaker of the House came to me and he said, we've been deliberating and bless you. And he said, basically, they're going to bring the flag down, but they want to replace it with another type of Confederate flag. And I said, no flag. We can't do it. Flag to me is very different than monuments. A flag is a living, breathing, representative symbol. Monuments are lessons in time. And so I said, go back. I'm not going to accept anything unless the flag comes down. He came back again and said, okay, we've agreed the flag is coming down. We're not going to replace it with anything else. But they want to keep the flagpole up. Now, I had served in the legislature. I knew exactly what they were thinking. They thought if they kept the flagpole up, they would get that flag right back up again. And so I said, that's not possible. He said, I can't move them. This is where we are. He goes, you should take the win. It's a win for you. But that wasn't a win. And so I went to the legislators and I said, look, I want to tell you a story. And I told him about a story when my father one day let me go with him to Columbia. And that was the big city, and I was so excited. And he would always stop at produce stands. He loved to buy things directly from farmers. And he stopped, and he was getting produce and putting it in his basket. And I looked over, and I saw the owners near the cash register acting really nervous. And the next thing I knew, a police car drove up really fast. And the policeman came out, and he was talking to the owners, and they were looking at my dad. And my dad finished getting his produce, went to the register, paid for his things, and thanked them. And we got back in the car, and my dad didn't say a word to me the whole way home because he was hoping I didn't notice. And I knew exactly what had happened. And I told the legislature that story, and I said, every time I pass that fruit stand, I feel pain. And I don't want anyone driving past the State House and feeling that same pain, seeing the flag, the pole, or anything that was like that. Let's respectfully put it in a museum where people can respect it the way it should be. And a few more hours of debate, and the flag came down, and the flagpole came down. And I have said often that I have so much gratitude for the people of South Carolina because we didn't have riots, we had vigils. We didn't have protests, we had hugs. And after a bitter debate, the people of South Carolina showed the world what grace and strength look like in the eyes of tragedy.
That had to be one of the proudest moments you had as serving as governor, I'd imagine, and of your fellow country or fellow statesmen.
It was a painful time. I mean, it was one that I talk about in the book. It was actually something that was very hard because I was very emotional. I attended all 9 of the funerals. They were all open casket. You saw the families fall over those that they lost. I knew too much about what happened in the room with the killer and what he had done. And I started to show signs and symptoms that were difficult. I would go out and do a press conference and I'd come back in and I'd cry. I'd come home and I'd get in the bed and I'd cry. And I just couldn't stop. And we had my chief of staff and her husband, who was my doctor at the time, they were over for dinner. And I just lost it in front of them. And he said, "You're showing signs of PTSD." And I felt so guilty because I said, I wasn't in that room. I didn't lose a loved one. I didn't go through all of that. And that's when I found that you can get PTSD from the trauma of the experience. You don't have to be in the room. And so I sought therapy and threw myself into other aspects. When we had a hurricane, I desperately wanted to save everyone. When we had a 1,000-year flood or another school shooting, I just kept getting deeper and deeper into my work trying to protect people. But it was a strong lesson of, my husband, he's in the military. I assumed PTSD happened to people on the battlefield or people who had experienced trauma firsthand. But it was an experience that I learned that sometimes you suffer even when you're on the outside.
So in describing your move serving as governor to serving on the international stage as one of the world's most influential diplomats, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, dealing with state government, foreign policy, other countries, first I have to ask you, was that a difficult decision for you to accept?
It was an interesting decision in that I knew the president prior to him being elected. When I was governor, when I won the primary for governor the first time I ran, I got this white envelope with this great gold trim on it, and there was a support check in it, and there was a note that said, "You're a winner." And so I called him then, and we were acquaintances throughout the years, and then we had a Republican primary, and there were 16 people on that stage, and I remember just being so excited about all the talent that we had on the stage, and I put my support behind a different candidate in which the president tweeted, "Nikki Haley is an embarrassment to South Carolina." And which I responded in a tweet that said, "Bless your heart." So, but I knew that when he was kicked, he howled. He knew that when I was pushed, I pushed back. And so, we still had great respect for each other. Fast forward, he wins the primary. I support him in the general. And then I get a phone call from Reince Priebus, who was his chief of staff. And he said, "Nikki, the president-elect wants to talk to you." And I said, "About what?" And he said, "He wants to talk to you about Secretary of State." I said, "Reince, I can't be Secretary of State. I'm a governor." And he said, "Well, he wants to see you. I need you to come to New York tomorrow." So went to New York the next morning, walk in, and the first thing he says is, "Well, I guess your guy didn't win." Because he could never let anything go. So we chatted, and I said, "Look, I'm not your person." I said, "We've got too much going on in the world. You don't need someone with a learning curve, but I want to help you, support you in any way that I can so that you're successful." Fast forward until that Friday, Reince calls again, and he says, "Don't say anything. I just need you to listen. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations." I said, "Reince, I don't even know what the United Nations does. I just know everybody hates it." And he said, "Well, the president's going to call you on Monday. I need you to be ready." So we get home. My husband's on the computer and said, "Nikki, I think you'd be pretty good at this." But it was a tough time because our son had just turned 15. Our daughter was a freshman in college. Michael and I take care of my parents. They live with us. They're both in their 80s. My mom has Parkinson's, so it just wasn't going to be something that we could quickly, easily do. And so the president called on that Monday, and he said, all right, Nick, are you going to do this? And I said, well, sir, there would have to be some conditions in place. He said, okay, what are they? I said, well, I've been a governor. I don't want to work for anyone else. I would want to work directly with you, so it would need to be a cabinet position. He said, done. What else? I said, well, I'm a policy girl, and I would want to be in the room when decisions are made, so I would need to be on the National Security Council. He said, done. What else? I said, well, I'm not going to be a wallflower or a talking head. I need to be able to say what I think. And he said, Nikki, that's exactly why I want you to do this. And he was true to his word from the first day to the last day.
So you also described the UN, and as I think we're all aware, as a very tough place to work. I know you've been frustrated probably at times, and you've had some maybe difficult conversations around that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Well, the UN is not for the soft of heart, that's for sure. It is a place where literally I felt every day like I put on body armor. I knew that there was going to be a fight that day. I just didn't know which country it was going to be. So, but I did obviously a crash course in foreign policy, knowing who our friends were, who our foes were, where the conflicts were, where the opportunities were. But I purposely didn't study the do's and don'ts of the UN. I didn't study the protocols. I wanted to go in with fresh eyes. I wanted to go in where I was just focused on what I needed to accomplish and not on how they wanted me to accomplish it. And so, you know, it was something that I knew. My thought process was I wanted to go in and I wanted countries to know what the United States was for and what we were against, and there be no gray. They didn't have to like us, but I wanted them to know exactly where we stood. And so I remember there was one of the stories where Assad had just done the chemical weapons attack against all those men, women, and children. And Russia was just being ridiculous, like Russia is, and was saying, this didn't really happen, the Europeans did it, they made it up. They were creating all of these things. And the day before, I had been looking at those images of those children that had died, and it's a horrific way to die. And I told my staff, I said, print me those pictures. And I didn't know why, but then that next day when Russia was just spouting off and China was acting so cold, when giving my speech, I stood up with pictures of those children, and I looked at Russia and I said, how many more children have to die before Russia cares? Well, apparently you're not supposed to do that. But it was the only way I could get their attention. And you know, the Security Council in the other countries, they got used to me doing what I do, and they let me do it. And so, you know, there was obviously defending America was one of the most amazing blessings I could have ever had. But then there was also dealing with the president, and there was never a dull moment in dealing with the president. So we were in constant communication. I was in DC at least once a week or every other week for National Security Council meetings. We were on the phone constantly. And many people want to know how I left the administration without a tweet. And the simple answer is I was honest with the president. If he was doing something right, I supported him, I rallied, I helped whatever way I could. And if I thought he was making a mistake, I would call or meet with him. And I would say, I think you're making a mistake. Instead, I think you should do X. And he would say, well, how do you see that playing out? And we would have a conversation. He always listened. He was always willing to change his mind. It didn't mean I won all the time, but it very much meant that I was always heard, and he was always looking for opposing views as well. But there was the first high-level week we had. I'll take the claps. So we have the first high-level week, and this is when you have all 193 countries send their heads of state and highest members of their delegation to New York for a week. And you give your speech to the world, you have your meetings in the name of peace and security. And so this was a really important week for the president, and I wanted to make sure we had all his meetings lined up, and he was going to give his first major speech, and so I wanted to make sure we had his foreign policy speech lined up. And so he gives me a call on that Sunday, and he said, okay, just wanted to follow up, are we all set? And I said, yes, sir, we've got you all scheduled, set to go. And he said, did you get the speech? And I said, I did, it's fantastic, and it was. And I said, but Mr. President, I just want to kind of give you a little bit of insight of what you're getting ready to walk into. I said, the UN is a different kind of place. I said, when you give your speech, it's not going to be like a rally. I said, they're not going to clap for you, but I don't want you to take it personally. I want you to think of it like church. It's just going to be like church. He said, church, got it. He said, but I want to ask you a question. And I said, what? He said, what do you think about me referring to Kim as Little Rocket Man in the speech? I said, sir, remember the part I said about church? He said, I know, but I tweeted it out this morning and it killed on Twitter. I said, I don't know what kind of response you're going to get, but you're the president. If you want to say it, you can, but I just can't make any promises. So that Tuesday, he's there to give his speech, North Korean delegation in the front row. And he starts his speech, and then he does it. And you see everybody kind of looking. Remember, they got their earpieces in, right? Their translator pieces. And all of a sudden you see. And then they start to laugh. North Korean delegation gets up and walks out. And I have a meeting 2 or 3 hours later with the president of Uganda. And he says, so tell me, Madam Ambassador, what are we going to do about this little rocket man? And literally by the end of that week, everybody was referring to Kim as Rocket Man.
So, Ambassador, you were directly involved with most of the biggest and most consequential foreign policy decisions of the Trump administration. Getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, getting off the Human Rights Council, also moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I think we're all well aware that for decades the UN has unfairly recognized Israel, and even before your confirmation, you pledged a strong defense to Israel. On Monday, the Trump administration announced that the U.S. would no longer consider the settlements to be inconsistent with international law. If going forward the U.S. is to accept a continued settlement of the West Bank, then should the future model be a one-state solution? Israelis, Palestinians have the same rights and voting power? Or do you really think a two-state solution of an independent Palestine is possible?
So the Israel policy was an interesting one. I had not had a lot of, obviously, interaction that involved Israel. I did, when I was governor of South Carolina, we were the first state that fought the BDS movement and passed legislation against that, which was the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Act. So when I got to Israel, when I got to the UN, Israel was one where the United States had really let them down. In December, before I took office, there was a resolution that basically just ignored anything that happened in the 1967 war with Israel. It humiliated them in a horrible way. And the United States had always fought against that, and we had a veto and had always used it. But on this one, the United States didn't veto it. They let it happen, and not only did they let it happen, we found out that the United States led the charge on it. And so there was a protocol, again, one that I broke, that normally when you're at the UN, you meet with the permanent members of the Security Council first, which was, you know, the 5 members are US, France, China, Russia, and the UK. And I purposely made one of my first meetings with Israel. And I listened to Ambassador Danny Danone talk about that day, and he said he had been trying to reach the US ambassador for a few days because he heard rumblings from other countries that this resolution was going to happen, and they wouldn't return his call. And then on that day, when you have a resolution about your country, you have to sit at that big U-shaped table with everyone else. And on that day, when that resolution passed, the entire audience and every member of the Security Council stood up and applauded. And there was Danny just sitting there, completely humiliated. And I told him that on my watch, that would never happen again as long as I was at the UN. And what I noticed at the UN was just what I referred to as Israel bashing. They would kick Israel because they had. They would kick Israel because they could. And I went back to being that girl on the playground that got my back up, that never liked bullies, that wanted to fight back. And so I started to fight back for Israel. And when the president made the very courageous move to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it was a defining moment because every president had campaigned on it, and I think every president genuinely wanted to do it. But what happened was the same thing that happened to President Trump happened to them, which is their own cabinets and national security teams would say, you can't do it. If you do this, the sky will fall, people will die, all of those things. And I supported the president, the vice president supported the president, and Ambassador Friedman, the Israeli ambassador, supported the president. Everybody else was opposed to him doing that. And he said, we're going to do this. And the reason that was important was it was acknowledging a truth. We have our embassy in the capital in every country. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That embassy needed to be in Jerusalem to acknowledge a truth to the Palestinians as well, because the UN would always play this game of appeasing the Palestinians, but we're never going to get to a peace agreement if you lie to them. You have to acknowledge. Now, that didn't say where our borders were going to be. We're going to allow the Israelis and the Palestinians decide how they want to divide it up, how they want to do the borders. But for us, that was acknowledging a truth. And the recent situation that the president did, again, was another defining of the truth. That was after the 1967 war, those borders were established. President Carter switched it and was the first one to say that settlements were illegal and that they shouldn't do it. President Reagan flipped it back and said, no, this is fact, this is truth, settlements can happen. President Obama switched it again. So this was the president saying, we're going to go back to a truth. And I think that that's hugely important. The Palestinians deserve a better life. They absolutely do. Their quality of life is terrible, and they deserve a better life. But I will tell you that we have tried to bring them to the negotiating table, and Israel is willing to come, and the leaders in the Palestinian community won't do it, when they know the only place the Palestinians would go is up. So what I strongly believe is they need to come to the table for a peace agreement. If a two-state solution is what they decide, we should do it. If they decide something else, we should do it. But they have to come to the table. We can't have Israel negotiating with itself.
So when you arrived at the UN, it was also a scary time in terms of escalating nuclear threat with North Korea. Where should the negotiations with North Korea go from here?
Well, let's go back. When I first got to the United Nations, North Korea was launching and testing long-range ballistic missiles every other weekend. We were having constant emergency Security Council meetings after they would do this. If you looked at the intelligence, it wasn't just Japan and South Korea that needed to be concerned. It was an absolute threat to the United States. And so what we knew was any money going into North Korea wasn't going to feed its people, it was going to feed the nuclear program. And we needed to slow that production down. And so me and my team pushed hard for 3 sanctions packages that would basically cut off the revenue. And we passed 3 of the largest sanctions on any country in a generation. We cut off 90% of their trade, 30% of their oil, shut down their foreign labor program, and it basically brought the North Koreans to the table. But it was not hard. I mean, it was not easy at all, because in order to do that, we had to convince China. And China didn't want to upset the North Koreans, and China knew that the rest of the council would look to them to see if they agreed with it. And I would have lunch with Dr. Henry Kissinger every other month and just listen to him and from a history standpoint. And he reminded me that what I did as governor also applied as ambassador, which is when you're in a negotiation, look at what the other side is afraid of. Look at what their vulnerabilities are. And so what I knew with China was they were scared of 2 things. They didn't want war on the peninsula, and they didn't want the Kim regime to fall because they didn't want all those North Koreans going into China. And so in the negotiations, a lot of what we would do is say, look, if we do this, this will keep us from going to war. And I made assurances that we weren't looking for regime change and that that wasn't going to happen. And I had confirmed that with the president. And then if that didn't work, I would say, I don't know what President Trump's going to do, so you may want to go ahead and do this. Russia would then get upset, and once we got China on board, Russia would say, well, we weren't included in the negotiations. And that's when I would say, look, if you want to be the one standing there holding Kim's hand, you go ahead and veto it, and the rest of the world will be against you. And then we were able to get Russia on board as well. And so I think with the first meeting of the president and Kim, it was a great sign that they had a conversation about denuclearization, which needed to happen. The second meeting, Kim did what many of his predecessors had done before, which was, if you remove the sanctions, we will not produce any nuclear weapons. Well, we had been there and done that, and the president didn't want to relive those mistakes. And he was right to walk away and say, we're not going to do that. And now I think it's going to be touchy. I think that North Korea is doing what they and Iran love to do, which is try and scare us into making a decision. What we have to do is hold the international community tight, not show any weakness, keep the sanctions strong, and somehow get into a brokering trust deal with North Korea that if you do this, we will do this, and kind of get a back and forth going. So we'll see, but it's going to be a sticky situation. The good news is there has not been another long-range ballistic test since then, and we just have to keep that from happening.
So the title of your book is With All Due Respect, which refers to a very public disagreement you had with another member of the administration. I think you're all a little familiar with the context, but maybe you could shed a little more light from the exchange.
So we had a National Security Council meeting in which we were going to put additional sanctions on Russia. We had already done a set of sanctions, but we were going to do even more sanctions on Russia. We'd had the debate on it. We had decided to do it. The next day I had talked to the president. We were still doing it. And I only did Sunday shows when the White House asked me to. And so they had asked me to go on Face the Nation on that Sunday morning. And I was, talking about the situations with Russia, and I said, and sanctions will be coming down on Russia. If Steven Mnuchin hasn't done them already, that will happen tomorrow. I get a call that afternoon from Steven Mnuchin, who's a great friend, and he said, Nikki, we've got a little bit of a problem. The president changed his mind. Now, the president has every right to change his mind. I mean, these things are touch and go, and he had every right to change his mind. So I said, okay. I said, well, then, just fix it. Let's get them to put a statement out tomorrow morning that, he's changed his mind. So the White House puts out a statement the next day. It doesn't clarify what happened. The press continues to call us saying, why did you say there were going to be sanctions when there's not? What happened? I, at that point, called the Secretary of State, I called National Security Advisor Bolton, I called the Chief of Staff, and I said, look, you have to clarify this. Just tell the truth. Just say he changed his mind, he's going to look at it at a further date. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But I've got these reporters that are all over us calling. We have to give them an answer. You know, let's do something. They all just kind of let me talk, didn't say anything. Tuesday morning comes around, press heat hasn't let up, and I call them back and I go, okay, you've got until 5 o'clock today to set the record straight. Either you do it or I do it, and it's much better if you do it. Nothing happens until about 4:45, close to 5. Larry Kudlow comes out and does a press conference, and he says, they ask him about it, and he says, well, I think Nikki was just momentarily confused. I heard that happened. I looked at the television. The 5 was getting ready to come on Fox. So I texted my friend Dana Perino and I said, can you call me? And so she called and I said, I just need to put out a comment. And she said, okay, what do you want to put out? And I said, could you just say, with all due respect, I don't get confused. She said, that's it? She said, that's it? And I go, that's it. I'll text it to you so that you have it in print. And so she goes and she says it. Within 5 minutes, Larry Kudlow calls me. Nikki, I'm so sorry. I have my tail between my legs. You know I love you. You know I love you. I'm so sorry. You know, and I said, Larry, at what point would you ever say that someone is confused? At what point would you ever say that I am confused? I know, you're right. I shouldn't have done it. And I said, no, you shouldn't have done it. And now you need to go fix it. And he said, I'll do whatever. And I said, well, you need to go clarify that I am not confused. He said, well, I can't do that. I said, oh, you can, and you will. And to his credit, within about 10 minutes, he called a reporter, said that he had made a mistake. And, you know, it's a lesson. I know we've got some high schoolers in the room, and I know we've got some young professionals in the room. No one is going to watch out for your integrity but yourself. And there are times and places when you have to do something to protect your own name ID.
Well, I think we can all sympathize with you when we say, bless your little heart, Larry. So in the last chapter of your book, you talk about how it seems like America is going through growing pains and disrupting the status quo, which I think we can all agree has been demonstrated by this administration. What are your thoughts on how divided our politics has become and maybe some hope for the future?
Well, I think that it's a very frustrating time right now. Our politics is toxic. Our country is as divided as I think we've ever seen it. The way you know that is if you look in D.C., if someone puts down a piece of legislation, everyone wants to know whose it is before they decide if they're going to support it. And that's when you know we've hit rock bottom. But what bothers me more is that now each side is referring to the other side as evil. And that hits a nerve with me because I've seen evil. I've been to the Democratic Republic of Congo where they use rape as a weapon of war. I've been to South Sudan where I've sat with a crying mother who told me the story about how the military came in, took her baby from her arms and threw him in a fire. She was then forced to eat his flesh. I've been on the Simon Bolivar Bridge where thousands of Venezuelans have crossed over, walking for hours in the sun holding their babies to get the one meal they might get that day. The average Venezuelan adult has lost 24 pounds. I've had to look at those images of children that died from the chemical weapons attacks in Syria. That's evil. We have policy differences. They should be debated. We should be passionate about it. But we need to remember to be grateful. because on our worst day, we are blessed to live in America.
So a few questions from the audience. What made you get involved in politics?
I was never that kid. I was not the one in student government. I wasn't the one in college Republicans. When I was growing up, my mom had a business, and her bookkeeper was leaving and needed someone to train. And the bookkeeper went to her and said, "I'm concerned, we don't have anyone for me to train, time is running short." And I was walking by, and my mom grabbed my arm and said, "Train her, she can do it." She said, "She's 13. And my mom said, "If you train her, she will do it." And so at 13, I was balancing the bank statement. I was doing the payroll. I was cutting the checks. I was, going through the deposits and all of those things. And, I learned the value of a dollar very early. When times were tough, we learned to stretch, prioritize, and get creative. And when times were good, we didn't celebrate because we knew the bad times were going to happen again. So I developed a love of numbers and how you can solve so much just by knowing what the numbers and the facts were. Went on and got a degree from Clemson in accounting, and then went on and worked in the corporate world and was accounting supervisor for a company and 6 of their subsidiaries. And I got tired of working for the guys down the hall and went and started working in our family's business. And one day I was complaining about how hard it was to make a dollar and how easy it was for government to take it. And my mom said, "Quit complaining about it, do something about it." I did not know you weren't supposed to run against a 30-year incumbent in a primary. I really didn't. Ignorance is bliss. But once I got in, the only option was to win. And so my husband got in the driver's seat, I was in the passenger seat, our 2 little ones were in the back seat, and I knocked on doors. And bottom line is, I thought there were way too many lawyers at the State House, and they needed one really good accountant.
Next question, should the U.S. be worried about China's increasing presence in Latin America? Or let's say China's increasing presence.
We should be worried about China, period. It is our #1 threat. And the reason, if you look at just the story of China, first of all, they are strengthening their military, which is a national security threat to us. They have literally, the U.S. was very naive in helping them get into the World Trade Organization. They've literally done nothing but cheat ever since. We lose over $50 billion a year just in intellectual property theft alone. They have put almost 1 million Uyghurs or Muslims in re-education camps, making them change their name, change their religion, change their way of thinking. If any other country was doing that, the world would be up in arms, but because it's China, no one's saying anything. They literally have invested not just in Latin America, all over the world. And they go into these countries and they run up the debt so much that when the countries can't pay it back, just imagine when they say, "Okay, then give us your port," or "We want to put a military installation." Now you look at that map and it'll send a chill up your spine. President Xi has started a committee that he now chairs, and this is the part that really bothers me, is any company that does business in China now has to cooperate with the Chinese military. So think about that in terms of the tech companies and all of the information on us that they have, and now the fact that the Chinese military will have it as well. So it's a big threat. It doesn't mean we shouldn't talk with them. It doesn't mean we shouldn't trade with them, but we should absolutely let them know that we're on to them and not let up at all.
A student from Sam Houston State, just down the road, asks, how would you address younger members of the Republican Party, and where do you see their place being in the future of politics?
I am very, very excited about the younger generation because they know the power of their voice. They're going to use it. We just have to get the right information in front of them. And I think what's really important for younger students coming up is push through the fear. When you're faced with a challenge, our instincts are to step back. But if you lean into it and you push through the fear, you find out you're so much stronger on the other side. If I didn't push through the fear, I never would have run for the legislature. If I didn't push through the fear, I wouldn't have become governor. If I didn't push through the fear, I certainly wouldn't have jumped and become ambassador. And so when you push through the fear, you don't live with any regrets. You just live with the strength of what you've been able to do, and you help people in the process. And so we need you. We need you to use the power of your voice. We need you to learn from the mistakes that we're making now and decide how you're going to make our country better and strengthen it. Because I do think the next generation is really going to be doing fantastic work in the future.
So the phrase, with all due respect, is like a national phenomenon, and it demonstrates that only in America could an Indian girl born of immigrants into a small town rise to be the governor of her state and to become the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. What haven't you accomplished yet? And what's next?
You know, I am blessed. I mean, I've been blessed to serve the state that raised me and blessed to serve the country I love so much. And so I think what's next is the fact that I love talking to normal people and not Russia and China. That's been really great. The reason I wrote the book now is I knew the facts would be what they were, but I wanted to take you into the emotions of it. What it felt like during some of those challenges, what it was like in those back rooms, what they were really saying behind, the ambassadors were really saying at the UN. But talk about it from the standpoint of the challenges that I had, whether it was being a woman or a mom or any of those things that go along with it, and hope that I could at least let you know the lessons that I learned along the way. So the book, I wanted to do that. And then I've started a policy group. Our son and our daughter, senior in high school, senior in college, they don't get their news from television or newspaper. They get it online. And so we started Stand for America because I wanted an outlet for them to get news that they could take in. And so Stand for America, you can go to standforamerica.com. It talks about capitalism versus socialism. It talks about Medicare for all. It talks about why there's an anti-Israel bias at the UN. And we put out just e-blasts that give you a couple of stories to keep you in the know. And that way, it allows me to talk to college students and high school students too, so I've enjoyed that. And I'm out there campaigning for people that I appreciate. I've done an event, and we'll do more for the president. I've been doing them for members of the Senate and the House, as well as governors. And so I'm having a good time right now. It's been great to take a breath and just continue to do all the things that I love.
Now, Nikki wants to have a photo with all of us, so I'm going to ask you all just to remain seated for just a few minutes, but I hope you've enjoyed our 50th anniversary celebration.